Hello again, everybody. In today's lesson, we're going to begin our section of the course on English composition, i.e. writing in English. And this section will be 11 lessons long, with specific lessons devoted to vocabulary to give you extra tools to use while you write. And the other lessons will be more theoretical, to tell you how to do it. And today, we're going to start our lessons with formal writing, in particular, formal letter writing in English. Now, why do we have to write a formal letter in English? Normally, a formal letter is written when you do not know the recipient. Here, this person has never been introduced to you. They don't know you. They wouldn't know Chris Reese from John Doe. So in this case, your formal letter is your introduction as well. This lets the other person know everything that they think they need to know about you. And it's important to use proper formal language in these cases to make a good first impression. Now, formal letters can be written for a variety of reasons. For example, to present information, or to make a request or an inquiry, as well as to recommend someone or something, as well as a few less pleasant things, like to complain or to apologize. Now, it's very, very important when you're writing a formal letter that you keep in mind who your audience is. Because while we say formal letters, there are different degrees of formality. Do you need to be semi-formal? Do you need to be just very, very formal, so much that you are constantly speaking in formal English? And all of this will be determined by who is receiving your letter. Who is your audience? They determine what the tone is. And as always, when you are writing a formal letter, no matter how formal it is, you need to make absolutely sure that your grammar and your spelling in particular, are excellent and without mistakes. So I've talked a lot so far about how important formal writing is. However, how do I make formal English? What is required for English to be formal, or what is required for it to be informal? So let's examine formal language for a second. To begin, formal styles of writing should use sophisticated vocabulary. Now by this, I mean that instead of saying words like smart, you should instead say intelligent. Also, avoid using any phrasal verbs in English. For example, instead of to find out, you should say to discover. And instead of to put off, to postpone. And to say sorry, to apologize. Here, every phrasal verb in English has a singular verb equivalent. That is the verb that you are going to need to use, particularly in formal writing. Next, be sure not to use any strong emotional words or idioms. For example, if I'm writing formally, I should never say, I felt under the weather, because that's an idiom. It's more casual. I should say that I felt slightly ill instead. And instead of saying a phrase, for example, like terrible experience, I should temper it. I should make it less. And I should say something like an unpleasant experience instead. As such, when you are reading formal letters, you should understand that words like unpleasant experience may be much stronger than they are written literally. Next, be sure to use full sentences without omissions or contractions. For example, the word didn't, or the word didn't, should become the phrase did not, and the word haven't should turn into the word have not. This is true for any and all short forms and contractions. Even though we speak with them, and even though in some formal situations people may still speak with them, we never ever write with them, especially in formal English. Next, be sure to include set phrases and cliches that are very typical of formal writing. Here, this may feel a little bit like cheating, but I promise, There are a lot of phrases that if you read a lot of formal letters and a lot of formal writing, you will see over and over and over again. And these are completely okay to use. As a matter of fact, they are preferred, and they will make you sound more fluent. For example, instead of saying the phrase "send it soon," you can say, "I would appreciate it if you send it at your earliest convenience." Both of these sentences are exactly the same, but in formal language, "at your earliest convenience" is like another way of saying "as soon as possible." You should use an impersonal tone achieved by the use of passive constructions, but be careful not to overuse it. I usually explain to my students that passive voice in formal writing is like salt. If you add it to food, it makes it better. But if you add it too much, it will ruin your dish. Here, passive voice is the same way. And let's look at an example. We can say that services you provide, or I can say services provided by you. Here, I'm just changing my language to make it sound more impersonal. I'm talking about the service, not about you. And finally, we use formal linking words and conjunctions and transition words. Instead of simply and, but, and or, there are many more words that we can use in English, such as instead of anyways, we would say nevertheless. And instead of also, we would change to in addition. And finally, instead of but, it's much more common to say however. Using these formal conjunctions will make your letters sound much more professional and much more formal. Now, you should also know that formal letters also have a very particular layout. Now, let's look at this layout in a little bit more detail. First, you should know that your address should be written in the top right corner. And the address of the person you are writing to, similarly, should be on the left, slightly lower than yours. Next, the date should be displayed right below your address on the right, and the greeting should be on the left, just beneath the date. Then follows the main body of your letter, which, as a rule, consists of several paragraphs, usually somewhere between 3 and 5. After the main body, you will sign off your letter with the appropriate closing line, or with an appropriate closing line. And finally, you put your signature and your name on the left. Now, be sure when you are at the exam to read this task carefully, because most likely you will not be required to address your letter, i.e., the first part, your address and their address, will not be necessary. Now, let's consider the structure of a formal letter in a little bit more detail. When we begin our letter, first we need to decide on the appropriate greeting. Now, if you don't know the name and or the gender of the recipient, it's best to use the greeting "Dear Sir" or "Madam," or "Dear Sir" or "Ma'am." Now, pay attention to the comma at the end of this greeting, "Dear Sir" or "Ma'am," or "Dear Sir" or "Madam," comma. And if you are writing to someone with a name, "Dear John," it works the same, with a comma. Now, you may also use a colon after this. However, using a colon after your greeting makes your letter very, very, very formal. Too formal for most situations. And it's typically only used in very important letters, like the kind you receive from the government, or for complaints. In your writing task, it will most likely be too formal, even for a formal letter. So in your writing task, just stick to a comma. It's better if you don't know which one to use. Now, in some circumstances when you're applying for a job or when you're making some sort of request, it will probably be better if you know the name of the person that you are writing to. And in most situations, it's better if you can find out the name of the recipient. So, in this case, I should say something like, "Dear Mr. Smith," or "Dear Miss Smith" for a woman. However, if you notice, they use different beginnings, Mr. for a man and Miss for a woman. But titles for women in English are a little bit more complicated than that. So let's look at them in their entirety. There are three forms of titles that we usually give to women. First, Mrs., M-R-S followed by a period. And this is used for women who are married. Literally, it says Misters. And some people don't like that. But we say Mrs. Next is the word Miss, spelled out, M-I-S-S. This is used for women who are not married, or for younger women in general. However, it's not really appropriate in a formal situation or in a business scenario. And finally, we have MS period. This is the abbreviated form of the last example, Miss. However, it looks much more professional, and it is much more professional and formal. And this is also the form we use for a woman whose marital status is unknown. If we do not know whether or not she is married, we simply assume that she is not. Now, in our formal letter, clearly we're giving preference to the last one, Miss. Now, in our case, because we're writing a letter of complaint, and we'd like to request something like an exchange or a refund, it would be much better to research who we are writing to. This makes sure, A, that our letter is received by the appropriate person, and B, that this person can help us. So, we'll start our letter in the following way. Dear Mr. Fitzberger. Now, we're going to be a little bit inconsistent at this point. And for now, we're going to skip to the closing of the letter, for where I sign off. Now, this should change depending on how I have opened my letter. And the opening that I use, either Dear Sir or Madam, or Dear Mr. or Mrs. Smith, changes also how I should close the letter. If I begin my letter with Dear Sir or Madam, I should close my letter with Yours faithfully, or simply faithfully. Here, the yours is optional, but you should use the word faithfully. However, if I begin my letter with Dear Mr. or Mrs. Smith, I should close my letter with Yours sincerely, or simply sincerely. So, since we're writing to Mr. Fitzberger, which one should we use? Right. Since we're writing to Mr. Fitzberger, we should say, Yours sincerely. So right now we have Dear Mr. Fitzberger and Yours sincerely. But we have a whole middle part of our letter that's missing, so let's talk about that now. Since we have our beginning and our end, we can begin with the introduction. And the introduction to a formal letter should always contain the reason for writing. This should always be the first sentence of your formal letter. And it should sound something like this. I am writing to request, or I'm writing to inform you, or I'm writing to complain about, or even I'm writing to apologize for, or I'm writing in response to your article, request, complaint, or even I'm writing to express my desire to, or I'm writing to express my dissatisfaction with. Finally, I could also say something like, thank you for your letter on this date concerning, or another phrase like, I am contacting you regarding. Here, if you noticed the I am writing structure in the first few examples. In a formal letter, this is not a part where you want to be very creative with your English. Here, it will be very tempting for you to want to make a very complex phrase or to try to flex your grammatical muscles. But here, we will almost always say something structured more simply. I am writing to. And be sure to remember to use the correct prepositions with these phrases. I'm writing to complain about. I'm writing to. Now, in formal letters, it's also very often necessary to state what you want as well as Details about time, place, the people you have previously spoken to, and most importantly, who you are. So now let's add an introductory paragraph or phrase to our letter. Dear Mr. Fitzberger, I'm writing to complain about the poor service I received at one of your restaurants on June 12th when I had a lunch break at Rose Bakery located at 12 Bright Avenue. Sincerely, Chris Reese. Here, in this sentence, there is no question about who I am, what I want, what I'm writing about, or what happened. Everything is stated very clearly and very explicitly. Now that we have our introduction, we should move on to talk about the main body of our letter. The main body of our letter is going to contain detailed information explaining what happened, and it needs to be organized in the following way. First, I need to arrange it in paragraphs, where each point that I want to make is its own self-contained, separate paragraph. Point A goes in paragraph A, and point B goes in paragraph B. Now, after your main point, these paragraphs should be filled with supporting details about your point. And it may be necessary to add examples or supporting evidence to really prove your point or to really let the reader understand your information. So, let's talk about how we can continue our letter. In my experience, in my bad experience at this restaurant, I have 3 points that I wish to discuss, which means that I should discuss them all in 3 separate paragraphs. Again, in a very concise manner without rambling, without speaking for too long. So, let's look at an example. First of all, it took 30 minutes for a waiter to notice me and take my order, although the restaurant was not excessively busy. Now that's my first point, and that's all, so on to the next paragraph. When the food finally arrived, it turned out the waiter brought me business lunch 3 instead of 2. It would not have been such a problem if I were not allergic to nuts, which, as you probably know, are contained in one of the dishes in business lunch 2. Now here, my paragraph is only 2 sentences really, but that's okay. It's a self-contained point. It's everything I want to say about point 2. So on to paragraph 3. After I explained the problem, the waiter was unexpectedly rude. He refused to change the lunch, but at the same time included it in my bill. Unfortunately, due to the great variety of reasons and types of formal letters that can be written, it's not very easy to include set phrases or cliches that you can include during the body paragraph. This is the part of the letter that you're really going to have to write yourself. And depending on who you are writing to, the main body will change as well. Now, finally, let's look at our conclusion. In the conclusion of our letter, I need to do a few things. First, I want to summarize the main body very shortly in 1 or 2 sentences, as well as outlining any actions that I want the recipient to take. Now, this part is very, very important, and a lot of people, including native speakers, will forget to do this. But it is imperative that you include an action or a request or what you expect at the end of your letter. You may also want to express your gratitude or to make an apology as well, depending on, again, what kind of letter you are writing. Now, unlike the main body, there are some set phrases here that we can use to help us write the conclusion. And let's look at a few of these. First, thank you for taking this into consideration. Next, I would be most grateful if you would look into this matter as soon as possible. Another phrase, I hope that you will give this matter your urgent attention, as well as I appreciate any feedback that you may have. And some more phrases to help you. Feel free to contact me by phone or email, as well as please do not hesitate to contact me should you require further information. I look forward to hearing from you, and please find attached. Now, when you use these, you are not limited to just one. Many letters will use 2 or 3 or maybe even more of these phrases in the conclusion, depending on what it is trying to do. So now, let's finish off our letter. Dear Mr. Fitzberger, as a result, I left the restaurant hungry and in a bad mood. I'm your regular customer, and changing the place of my lunch break would be both an inconvenience and a disappointment. I hope you will give this issue your consideration and will take the opinion of your customers into account. Sincerely, Chris Reese. And that's it for today. Review this lesson a couple times and try writing your own formal letters using the tips provided and using the examples that we have provided with this lesson. You can always read the full letter of complaint found in the attachments with this lesson, and I highly recommend that you examine this letter very closely for its format and for the language that it uses, because in formal letters, the language really doesn't change that much. So, review the materials, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye.